I never imagined that protecting someone else's legacy would cost me my own. 25 years of silence weighed heavily in my hands as I stared at the old leather journal hidden in my attic. The truth about my ex-husband's greatest hit, scrawled in his dying brother's handwriting. The Grammy award-winning song that launched Thaddeus's career wasn't his creation. It was Wesley's final gift to the world, penned hours before the accident that took his life. I watched Thaddeus steal those lyrics while his brother lay in a coma, and I said nothing. For 25 years I carried this secret to protect Wesley's daughter, our adopted Rosalind. But now, as Thaddeus drags my name through the media, claiming I destroyed his career out of jealousy, I wonder, what's worth more, the comfort of lies or the price of truth? Before we dive deeper into this story, tell me, how far would you go to protect someone else's legacy? Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's revelation will change everything. The day Thaddeus announced his tell-all interview with Rolling Stone magazine, I was in my garden studio, restoring vintage vinyl records, a hobby that had become my sanctuary since the divorce. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, preserving other people's music while the biggest lie in my life threatened to shatter everything I'd protected for a quarter century. My phone buzzed with a text from Dahlia Reeves, my closest friend and the only person who knew the truth. Turn on Entertainment Weekly. He's doing it again. I wiped my hands on my apron, leaving traces of vinyl cleaner on the worn fabric, and reached for the remote. There he was, Thaddeus Blackburn, still handsome at 54, his silver-streaked hair styled to perfect dishevelment, wearing that practiced expression of wounded artistry he'd perfected over the years. "My ex-wife," he said, his voice carrying that familiar hint of calculated vulnerability. She couldn't handle my success. The divorce was just the beginning of her vendetta. The interviewer, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 30, leaned forward sympathetically. "Are you saying Marlo Blackburn deliberately sabotaged your career?" Hearing my name from his lips made my hands tremble. I turned off the TV before he could continue his performance. The truth was far more complex than any magazine interview could capture. How do you explain that you watched the man you loved steal his dying brother's legacy? That you protected that secret to preserve what remained of a broken family? I walked to my study where Wesley's journal lay hidden behind a false panel in my antique writing desk. The leather was worn soft with age, the pages yellow and fragile. Opening it still brought back that hospital room smell, antiseptic and despair, from that fateful night in 1998. Wesley had always been the true artist of the family. While Thaddeus had the looks and charm, Wesley possessed that rare gift of turning raw emotion into poetry. He wrote songs that made you feel like he'd somehow reached into your soul and given voice to your deepest secrets. The song that would become Thaddeus's breakthrough hit, Midnight's Last Prayer, was Wesley's masterpiece, written in those final lucid hours before the accident that would claim his life. I remember watching Wesley write that night, his hospital gown hanging loose on his too thin frame, his fingers flying across the pages as if racing against time itself. He'd been admitted for what we thought was exhaustion, but the doctors had found something far worse. Terminal, they said. Months, maybe weeks. "Marlo," he'd said, beckoning me closer. "I need you to promise me something." I'd moved to his bedside, careful not to disturb the IV lines. "Anything," I'd replied, meaning it with all my heart. Wesley had always been more than my brother-in-law. He'd been my friend, my confidant, the person who understood my love of music beyond its commercial value. "Take care of my baby girl," he whispered, his eyes drifting to the nursery down the hall, where his newborn daughter lay sleeping. And make sure these songs find their way to someone who'll do them justice. He'd pressed the journal into my hands just before the seizure that would send him into a coma. 3 days later, he was gone. What happened next still haunts me. I'd stepped out to get coffee, leaving the journal on Wesley's bedside table. When I returned, I found Thaddeus there, hunched over the journal, frantically copying its contents into his own notebook. Our eyes met, and in that moment something fundamental shifted between us. He didn't try to hide what he was doing, didn't offer explanations or excuses. Instead, he said words that would echo through the next 25 years. This is how I'll take care of them both, Rosalind and Wesley's legacy. I should have stopped him then, should have exposed the truth before it grew into the monster it became. But Rosalind had just lost her father. Her mother had died in childbirth, and Thaddeus's logic, twisted as it was, held a certain desperate appeal. He would use Wesley's songs to build a career that would ensure Rosalind would want for nothing. We would raise her together, give her the family she'd lost, and Wesley's music would still find its audience, even if through his brother's voice. The success that followed was beyond anything we could have imagined. Midnight's Last Prayer became an instant classic, earning Thaddeus a Grammy and launching him into stardom. The raw emotion in Wesley's lyrics, combined with Thaddeus's magnetic stage presence, created something magical. Critics called it a breakthrough in contemporary folk rock, praising its authenticity and depth. Only I knew the true cost of that authenticity. For years I watched Thaddeus perform Wesley's songs, each one a dagger to my conscience. I threw myself into raising Rosalind, channeling my guilt into creating the warmest, most nurturing home possible. She grew into a remarkable young woman, creative, compassionate. With her father's gift for seeing beauty in life's quiet moments, she had no idea that the uncle she admired from afar was performing her father's heart on stages across the world. Our marriage, built on that fundamental deception, began to crack under its weight. Thaddeus became increasingly distant, as if my very presence reminded him of his fraudulence. The more successful he became, the more he drank, the more he toured, the further he drifted from the man I'd married. The guilt manifested differently in each of us. My silence became heavier, his behavior more erratic. The breaking point came during Rosalind's college graduation. She'd written her thesis on the evolutions of contemporary folk music, using her uncle, Thaddeus's career, as a case study. The pride in her voice as she presented her work, the way she quoted lyrics that her real father had written from a hospital bed, it was too much. That night, I told Thaddeus I wanted a divorce. He didn't fight it, not really. But he did make one thing clear. If I ever revealed the truth about the songs, he would make sure I regretted it. "Think about Rosalind," he'd said, his voice cold. "Think about how this would destroy her." As if I hadn't been thinking about her every day for the past 20 years. The divorce was quiet, at first. I kept the house where Rosalind had grown up, my garden studio, and enough financial security to maintain my independence. Thaddeus moved to Nashville, married a younger songwriter named Marigold, and continued performing. I focused on my vinyl, restoration business, finding solace in bringing old records back to life, in preserving music that deserved to be remembered. But then came the creative drought. Thaddeus hadn't released new material in years, and pressure from his label was mounting. That's when the narrative began to shift. Subtle at first, interviews where he hinted at personal struggles, the toll of his ex-wife's emotional manipulation. Then less subtle, social media posts about toxic relationships, about people who drain an artist's creativity. Dahlia, who'd worked as a music journalist for 30 years, saw it coming before I did. "He's setting you up," she warned over coffee. one morning. "He's creating a scapegoat for his writer's block. You need to protect yourself." But how do you protect yourself from a lie without revealing an even bigger one? The media circus grew. Thaddeus's new wife, Marigold, joined in, sharing cryptic posts about negative influences and artistic freedom. His management team began dropping hints about a revealing documentary in the works. My phone filled with messages from old friends, industry acquaintances, even Rosalind, all asking for my side of the story. Edmund Vale, the producer who'd launched Thaddeus's career, called me late one night. "Something's never sat right with me about those early songs," he said, his voice heavy with bourbon and suspicion. "They were different, deeper, more raw. Everything after that first album felt manufactured." I let his words hang in the silence, another weight added to my conscience. Now, as I sit in my studio, Wesley's journal in my lap, I face an impossible choice. Thaddeus's Rolling Stone interview promises to reveal the truth about our relationship, about the decline of his career. His version of the truth, a story of jealousy, sabotage, and artistic suppression, is already gaining traction online. Rosalind called yesterday confused and hurt, asking why I never told her my side, as if the truth could be so easily divided into sides, as if 25 years of protecting a dead man's legacy, of raising his daughter, of watching his brother build a career on stolen dreams, could be explained in a soundbite or a tweet. The journal in my hands holds the real story, Wesley's story. His last songs, his hopes for his daughter, his final words to a world he was leaving too soon. For 25 years, I've been the keeper of this truth, the guardian of a secret that protected some and imprisoned others. But as Thaddeus prepares to rewrite our history, I have to ask myself, what's the greater betrayal? Breaking a promise to the dead, or allowing the living to destroy what remains of the truth? Dahlia's text buzzes again. "The interview drops tomorrow. Whatever you're going to do it now." I run my fingers over Wesley's handwriting, over the lyrics that launched his brother's career and sealed my fate. 25 years of silence weighs heavy in these pages. Maybe it's time to let them speak. I reach for my phone and dial Edmund Vale's number. When he answers, I take a deep breath and say the words I've rehearsed countless times, but never spoken, aloud. "There's something you need to know about those early songs." Edmund's silence on the other end of the line stretched like a guitar string pulled too tight. I could almost hear him processing my words, connecting dots that had puzzled him for decades. Finally he spoke, his voice rough with realization. "The hospital! That's where it all started, wasn't it?" My hands trembled as I opened Wesley's journal to that fateful entry. The last thing he'd ever write. The pages were worn at the corners from years of secret readings, my private penance for the silence I'd kept. "Yes," I answered. "But there's more to the story than you could imagine." I began to tell him everything, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. As I spoke, memories flooded back with devastating clarity. The sterile hospital corridors, the beeping monitors, Wesley's fingers still stained with ink from writing, going limp as the seizure took hold. And Thaddeus, hunched over that journal like a thief in the night, stealing not just words, but an entire legacy. "I need to see it," Edmund said finally. "All of it. The journal, any proof you have. If we're going to stop this narrative he's spinning, we need to be absolutely certain." He paused, then added more gently, "And Marlowe, you need to be ready for what comes next. This isn't just about Thaddeus anymore." I knew he was right. The moment I'd dialed his number, I'd set in motion events that would ripple through lives far beyond my own. Rosalind. Sweet, talented Rosalind, who'd grown up idolizing her uncle, while her real father's genius lay hidden in my desk drawer. The next morning I arranged to meet Edmund at his home studio, a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. As I drove there, Thaddeus's latest interview played on the radio, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, dripping with practiced pain. Success changes people around you. Sometimes the ones closest to you can't handle seeing you shine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, fighting back the urge to scream at the radio. If only they knew how much I'd sacrificed to protect his shine. How many nights I'd lain awake wrestling with the weight of our shared deception. Edmund was waiting on his wraparound porch, looking exactly as I remembered him. Silver hair swept, back wire-rimmed glasses, that air of casual authority that had made him a legend in the industry. He'd been semi-retired for years, but his opinion still carried weight. If anyone could help me handle this properly, it was him. Inside his studio, time seemed to stand still. Gold records lined the walls, testament to decades of hit-making, and in the corner stood the very piano where Thaddeus had recorded his first album. Our first album. Wesley's album. "Show me," Edmund said simply, gesturing to the leather bag I clutched like a lifeline. With trembling fingers, I withdrew Wesley's journal and placed it on the mixing desk. The leather was soft with age, the pages yellow but the writing still clear. Wesley's distinctive scrawl, his soul poured onto paper in those final hours. Edmund read in silence, his expression growing more grave with each page. He lingered over midnight's last prayer, mouthing the words we'd all heard Thaddeus sing countless times on stages across the world. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I always wondered," he said quietly, "why he never wrote anything else that touched that level of raw emotion. Now I know." He removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This changes everything, Marlowe. You understand that, right? This isn't just about credits or royalties. This is about legacy, about truth, about Rosalind," I finished, for him. "I know. That's why I kept silent for so long. She was so young when Wesley died. And Thaddeus, he convinced me it was better this way, that the songs would provide for her, give her the life Wesley would have wanted." "And did they?" Edmund's question hung in the air like smoke. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A text from Dahlia. "Turn on entertainment tonight, now!" Edmund reached for his remote, and suddenly the studio was filled with Thaddeus's face, larger than life on the wall-mounted screen. "I'm finally ready to tell the whole story," he was saying, his voice carrying that perfect mix of vulnerability and strength that had made him famous. "My upcoming memoir, Silenced Songs, will reveal how my ex-wife's jealousy and manipulation nearly destroyed not just my career, but my very soul as an artist." I felt the blood drain from my face as he continued. She couldn't stand that the music came from a place she couldn't touch, couldn't control. The divorce was just the beginning of her campaign to discredit me, to poison my relationship with my family, especially with my beloved niece. Edmund muted the TV, turning to me with determination in his eyes. "We need to move fast. Once that book comes out, controlling the narrative becomes 10 times harder." He reached for his phone, fingers flying over the keypad. "I'm calling Angela Winters." My heart skipped. Angela Winters was more than just an entertainment lawyer. She was known as the industry's secret keeper, the person artists turned to when careers and legacies hung in the balance. Her involvement would make this real in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. "Wait," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "There's something else you need to see." From my bag, I withdrew a USB drive. Before Wesley, before the end, he recorded demos of some of the songs. Raw versions. Just him and his guitar. I've kept them all these years. Never showed anyone. Edmund's hands were steady as he took the drive, but I could see the excitement in his eyes. This was more than proof. This was Wesley's voice reaching out from the past, undeniable evidence of the truth we'd all buried. As the first notes filled the studio, I closed my eyes. Wesley's voice, rough and real, singing the words that would later make his brother famous. The original version of Midnight's Last Prayer was slower, more haunting. A dying man's meditation on legacy and love, not the polished radio hit it, would become. Jesus Christ, Edmund breathed. He'd worked with hundreds of artists over his career, but I could see Wesley's raw talent still had the power to move him. "This changes everything. We need to..." He was interrupted by a knock at the studio door. Through the glass, I could see Angela Winters herself, elegant in a charcoal suit despite the early hour. Edmund had worked fast. The next few hours passed, in a blur of legal terms and strategy sessions. Angela listened to everything. The story, the recordings, examined the journal, taking notes in her precise handwriting. Finally, she looked up at me with eyes that had seen every kind of industry. "Drama imaginable! Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "First, we file an immediate injunction against the memoir's publication. Then we prepare a comprehensive statement, not just about the songs, but about why you kept silent all these years. The focus needs to be on protecting Rosalind, on honoring Wesley's memory." "And Thaddeus?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We'll fight back," she said simply. "Hard. He has built his entire identity on these songs. He won't let them go, easily." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "The question is, are you ready for what this will do to Rosalind, finding out her father was the true genius, that her uncle is a fraud who built his career on stealing from her dead father?" I finished bitterly. "No, I'm not ready. I'll never be ready to hurt her like that. But I can't let Thaddeus destroy what's left of my life to protect his lie." As if on cue, my phone lit up with Rosalind's face. My heart clenched. She must have seen the interview. Angela and Edmund exchanged glances, then quietly left the room, giving me privacy for what would surely be one of the hardest conversations of my life. "Mom?" Rosalind's voice was small, confused. "What's going on?" "Uncle Theo's interview. He's saying such horrible things about you. This book he's writing. Why haven't you ever told me your side?" I gripped the phone tighter. Wesley's journal, heavy in my lap. "Sweetheart," I began, my voice trembling. "There's something I need to tell you. About your father, about your uncle, about everything." I took a deep breath. 25 years of silence pressing against my chest. "Can you come over? There's something you need to see." "I'm already on my way," she said, and I could hear the determination in her voice. Wesley's determination. "Whatever this is, Mom, we'll face it together." As I ended the call, I looked up to find Edmund and Angela watching me through the studio window. They nodded encouragingly, but I could see the concern in their eyes. They knew, as I did, that once I opened Wesley's journal for Rosalind, once I played her those recordings, nothing would ever be the same. I gathered my things slowly, carefully placing the journal and the USB drive back in my bag. As I prepared to leave, Edmund caught my arm. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Once we start, there's no going back." I thought about Thaddeus's smug face on the TV, about the lies he was preparing to publish, about Wesley's final request to make sure his songs found their way to someone who would do them justice. Most of all, I thought about Rosalind, who deserved to know the truth about her legacy. "I'm sure," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "It's time for Wesley's songs to finally be heard through his own voice." As I drove home to wait for Rosalind, Thaddeus's latest interview continued to play on every station, his manufactured pain filling the airwaves. But for the first time in 25 years, I felt something stronger than guilt or fear. I felt relief. The truth, so long confined to the pages of a hidden journal, was finally about to break free. And somewhere, I hoped, Wesley was watching, finally ready to reclaim his voice through the daughter he'd never had the chance to know. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through my living room windows as I waited for Rosalind. Wesley's journal lay on the coffee table between 2 cups of untouched tea, its presence as heavy as the truth it contained. I'd spent the last hour selecting photos from old albums, tangible pieces of the past that would help Rosalind understand the full scope of what I was about to reveal. The doorbell rang at exactly 4:30. Rosalind had always been punctual, just like her father. When I opened the door, the resemblance to Wesley struck me anew. The same thoughtful eyes, the slight furrow between her brows when she was worried. She hugged me tightly, and I held on perhaps a moment too long, knowing that in a few minutes, her world would shift irreversibly. "Mom," she said as we settled on the couch, "you're scaring me. I've never seen you like this." She glanced at the journal, the photos spread out on the table. "What's really going on?" "Uncle Theo's interview. Before I explain everything," I interrupted gently, "I need you to see something." I picked up the journal, its leather soft and familiar in my hands. "This belonged to your father." Rosalind's breath caught. We rarely spoke about Wesley. The pain had always seemed too fresh, too complex. She reached for the journal with trembling fingers, opening it to the first page, where Wesley's distinctive handwriting flowed across the paper. "These are songs," she whispered, her eyes widening as she began to read. "These are—" She stopped abruptly, her face draining of color. I knew exactly which lyrics she'd found, the opening lines of Midnight's Last Prayer, words she'd grown up hearing her uncle sing. "Keep reading," I encouraged softly, though my heart was hammering in my chest. "There's more." For the next hour, I watched as my daughter discovered her true legacy. She read every page, sometimes mouthing the words, sometimes stopping to stare at me with questions in her eyes. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming down her face. "All this time," she said, her voice barely audible. "All these songs. They were Dad's? Uncle Theo. He—" She couldn't finish the sentence. I reached for the USB drive. "There's more. Your father recorded demos of some of these songs before—" I swallowed hard. "Before the end. As Wesley's—" Raw, authentic voice filled the room. Rosalind closed her eyes. She'd grown up studying music, analyzing her uncle's songs for her thesis, never knowing she was actually studying her father's work. The emotion in Wesley's original version of Midnight's Last Prayer was undeniable. A father's love letter to the daughter he knew he wouldn't live to raise. When the song ended, the silence felt deafening. Rosalind's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why did you let him take credit? Why did you keep this from me?" I'd rehearsed this explanation countless times in my mind, but facing her now, words failed. Me. How do you explain choices made in grief, in fear, in misguided protection? Your father's last wish was for these songs to find their way to someone who would do them justice. I began slowly. When Thaddeus took them, he convinced me it was the best way to provide for you, to keep you connected to your father's legacy, even if you didn't know it was his. By letting Uncle Theo steal them. Her voice cracked with anger and hurt. By watching him build his entire career on a lie. I was wrong. I admitted, the words burning my throat. I know that now. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really just protecting the lie. And now... I gestured to the TV, where entertainment news was still buzzing about Thaddeus's upcoming memoir. Rosalind stood abruptly, pacing the room. His book. He's going to publish a book painting you as the villain, when all this time... She stopped, turning to face me with Wesley's determination in her eyes. We have to stop him. We have to tell the truth. I've already started. I told her, explaining about Edmund Vale, Angela Winters, the legal proceedings being set in motion. But Rosalind, you need to understand what this means. Once the truth comes out, everything changes. Your relationship with Thaddeus, your family history, even your academic work. My thesis, she said quietly, sinking back onto the couch. I wrote my entire thesis on the evolution of Uncle Theo's songwriting style. I analyzed these lyrics, these melodies, thinking they showed his artistic growth. She laughed bitterly. No wonder the later songs felt different. They actually were written by someone else. My phone buzzed. A text from Angela. Injunction filed. Press getting wind of something big. Thaddeus's team reaching out. Be prepared. As if on cue, Rosalind's phone lit up with Thaddeus's name. She stared at it for a long moment before declining the call. He knows, doesn't he? That's why he's doing this now, trying to discredit you before the truth comes out. I nodded. Edmund thinks he's been worried about this for years. That's why he's never been able to recreate the success of those early songs. He's been living in fear of the truth. Rosalind picked up the journal again, running her fingers over her father's handwriting. All these years, I thought I barely had anything of him. Just a few photos, some second-hand stories. But his soul was right here in these words, in these melodies. She looked up at me, her eyes shining with a mixture of grief and determination. We have to make this right, Mom. Not just for you, but for Dad. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of legal meetings and strategic planning. Angela worked tirelessly to build our case, while Edmund began the delicate process of reaching out to industry contacts who had always suspected something wasn't quite right about Thaddeus's sudden artistic genius. Thaddeus, meanwhile, launched a full media offensive. His interviews became more frequent, more pointed in their accusations against me. His new wife, Marigold, took to social media with cryptic posts about finally exposing the truth and standing by her man against those who would destroy him. The pressure began to mount from unexpected directions. Old family friends called, choosing sides without knowing the full story. My vinyl restoration clients started canceling appointments, worried about being associated with the brewing scandal. Even my garden, usually my sanctuary, offered little peace as paparazzi began camping outside the gates. Through it all, Rosalind remained my anchor. She took a leave of absence from her teaching position at the conservatory to help me organize Wesley's materials. Together we discovered more treasures hidden in the journal. Notes about songs never recorded, thoughts about music theory, and most precious of all, little messages to his unborn daughter scattered throughout the pages. "Listen to how the bridge transitions here," Rosalind said one evening as we analyzed Wesley's demo recordings. "The way he builds tension before releasing it. I've been teaching this technique to my students, never knowing I learned it from my own father's work." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Rosalind had built her academic career studying what she thought was her uncle's musical innovation, only to discover she'd been studying her father all along. The question of how to handle this revelation in academic circles was just one of many complications we faced. Angela called daily with updates. The injunction against Thaddeus's book was holding, but his legal team was fighting back hard. They claimed the statute of limitations on any copyright claims, argued that my silence for 25 years amounted to tacit approval, even suggested that Wesley had gifted the songs to his brother before his death. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "They're getting desperate," Angela reported. "They know, once we release the demos, once people hear Wesley's original recordings, there will be no denying the truth. But Marlo," she paused, her voice gentling, "are you ready for what comes next? Once we go public, there's no controlling how this story spreads." I looked at Rosalind, who was sitting at my piano, picking out the melody of one of Wesley's unreleased songs. In the fading light, she looked so much like him that my heart ached. "We're ready," I said firmly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." That night, as Rosalind slept in her old bedroom upstairs, I sat alone in my study, reading through old letters Wesley had written me before his illness. In one, dated just months before his diagnosis, he'd written about his hopes for his unborn child. "I want my music to be a bridge, Marlo, a way for my child to know me even if fate has other plans. Promise me you'll find a way to make that happen." I had failed that promise for 25 years, allowing Thaddeus to build his career on his brother's legacy while Rosalind grew up knowing only fragments of her father's true gift. But now, finally, I had the chance to make it right. My phone lit up with a text from Edmund. "Rolling Stone wants the exclusive. Full story, Wesley's demos, everything. Say the word, and we move forward." I thought about Thaddeus, about the empire he'd built on stolen dreams. I thought about Wesley, about the truth hidden in his journal for all these years. Most of all, I thought about Rosalind, finally discovering her real legacy. "Do it," I texted back. "It's time for Wesley's voice to be heard." As I set down my phone, I heard music from upstairs. Rosalind at the piano playing Midnight's Last Prayer, the way Wesley had originally written it, slower and more haunting than Thaddeus's version had ever been. In her hands, her father's song was coming home. Tomorrow the world would know the truth. Tomorrow the carefully constructed facade Thaddeus had built would begin to crumble. Tomorrow Wesley's real legacy would finally emerge from the shadows. But tonight, in the quiet of our home, a daughter was getting to know her father through the purest connection they could share. His music, played on the same piano where he had composed his final songs, her fingers finding the melodies he'd left behind like breadcrumbs leading her back to him. I closed my eyes and listened, letting the music wash over me. For the first time in 25 years, the weight of silence was lifting. In its place, I felt something new, beginning to grow. A chance for redemption, for truth, for healing. Wesley's voice through his music and his daughter was finally going to be heard. The morning the Rolling Stone article dropped, the world seemed to hold its breath. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee growing cold, as notifications flooded my phone. The headline was simple but devastating. The truth behind the songs, how a dying man's legacy was stolen. The article was comprehensive, brutal in its honesty. Edmund had provided the magazine with Wesley's demos, high-quality digital scans of the journal pages, and a timeline that methodically dismantled the myth of Thaddeus Blackburn's musical genius. But it was Rosalind's contribution that struck the deepest chord. Her first-person account of discovering her father's true legacy, accompanied by her expert musical analysis, comparing Wesley's original recordings with Thaddeus's commercialized versions. The truth was hidden in plain sight, she wrote. Every melody I studied, every lyric I analyzed in my thesis about my uncle's supposed artistic evolution, was actually my father's voice reaching out through time, trying to tell me who he really was. Within hours, the story went viral. Wesley Blackburn began trending on social media, with music critics and fans alike sharing side-by-side comparisons of the original demos and Thaddeus's versions. The industry reaction was swift and severe. Radio stations pulled Thaddeus's songs from rotation. Streaming platforms added asterisks to his catalog. The Grammy committee released a statement about launching an investigation. Thaddeus's response came through his publicist, a carefully worded statement about complicated family dynamics and misunderstandings about creative collaboration. But the evidence was undeniable. Wesley's journal, his demos, the dates, the documentation. It all told a story that no amount of PR spin could erase. Marigold, ever loyal, took to Instagram Live to defend her husband. "You don't know the whole story," she insisted, her voice brittle with barely contained panic. Theo loved his brother. Everything he did was to honor Wesley's memory, to give these songs the platform they deserved. But her words rang hollow against the weight of truth. Industry veterans began coming forward with their own stories. Moments when Thaddeus had seemed unsure about his own songs. Times when he'd been unable to explain his creative process. Occasions when he'd avoided detailed discussions about his songwriting technique. Edmund's phone call came just after noon. "It's bigger than we anticipated," he said, his voice grave. "The major labels are conducting internal reviews. There's talk of class action lawsuits from streaming services, concert, promoters, everyone who's invested in Thaddeus's career based on fraudulent claims." "And Rosalind?" I asked, watching my daughter field calls from academic colleagues. Her reputation as a music scholar suddenly complicated by her personal connection to the story. "She's handling it beautifully," Edmund assured me. "Her academic perspective adds a crucial credibility to our case. But Marlowe..." He paused. "Thaddeus is asking to meet. Just you, him, and Rosalind. No lawyers, no press." I glanced at the TV where entertainment news was running constant coverage of the scandal. Clips of Thaddeus performing Wesley's songs played on a loop, each one now tainted with the knowledge of their true origin. "What does Angela say?" "She advises against it. But..." Edmund sighed. "This is family. Sometimes legal strategy has to take a back seat to human necessity." I found Rosalind in the garden sitting on the bench where Wesley used to compose during summer evenings. She looked up as I approached, her eyes red but determined. "Uncle Theo wants to meet," she said before I could speak. "He's been calling nonstop." "We don't have to," I said, sitting beside her. "We can let the lawyers handle everything." She shook her head. So much like Wesley in that moment it made my heart ache. "No. I need to hear him say it. I need to understand." "Why?" She picked up her father's journal, which rarely left her side these days. All these years, every time he performed these songs, every time he accepted praise for Dad's work. How did he live with himself? The meeting was arranged for neutral ground, Edmund's home studio, where this had all begun just days ago. As we pulled up to the Victorian mansion, I spotted Thaddeus's car already in the driveway, its sleek black surface reflecting the late afternoon sun. Edmund met us at the door, his face serious. "He's in the studio. I'll be in my office if you need me." He squeezed my shoulder as we passed. "Remember, you're in control here." Thaddeus stood as we entered, and I was struck by how old he suddenly looked. The carefully maintained image of the artistic genius had crumbled, leaving behind a man haunted by his own deceptions. His eyes fixed on the journal in Rosalind's hands. "Rosie," he began, using the nickname she'd had since childhood. "If you'll just let me explain—" "Don't call me that." Rosalind cut him off, her voice sharp. "You don't get to act like nothing's changed. Everything has changed." He sank back into his chair, deflated. "You're right. Everything has changed." He looked at me, the arrogance from his recent interviews completely gone. "I never thought it would end like this." "How did you think it would end?" I asked quietly. "Did you really believe you could keep this hidden forever?" I thought. He ran a hand through his silver hair, now disheveled rather than artfully styled. "I thought I was doing the right thing. Wesley was gone. His daughter needed providing for. And these songs, they were too beautiful to stay hidden in a journal. They weren't yours to take?" Rosalind said, opening the journal to Midnight's Last Prayer. "This song, do you even know what it's really about? It's about me. It's my father's goodbye to his unborn daughter. And you turned it into a love song about summer romance." Thaddeus flinched. "I had to make them commercial, make them accessible. The originals were too raw, too personal, too honest," I suggested. "Too much like Wesley?" He stood abruptly, pacing the studio. "You don't understand. After he died, I was lost. These songs, they were a way to keep him alive, to give his music the audience it deserved. Yes, I took credit, and yes, that was wrong. But everything I earned from them went into a trust for Rosalind. Every penny." "I don't want your money," Rosalind said, her voice trembling. "I wanted my father, and you stole him from me twice. First by taking his songs, and then by changing them into something he never intended them to be." The truth of her words hung heavy in the air. Thaddeus stopped pacing, looking at the gold records on Edmund's wall, his brother's genius repackaged under his name. "The record label is dropping me," he said quietly. "The book deal is cancelled. Marigold." He laughed bitterly. "She's already talking to publishers about her own tell-all. Everything I built. Everything you stole," I corrected gently. "It was never yours to build." He turned to face us, and for the first time I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "What do you want from me? A public confession? My retirement? Name it." Rosalind stood, clutching her father's journal. "I want you to help me restore his legacy, not for money, not for fame, but because it's right. These songs deserve to be heard the way he wrote them, with his voice, his intention." "A tribute album," I suggested, the idea forming as I spoke. "Wesley's original demos, remastered. Your public acknowledgement of the truth. All proceeds to a foundation in his name, supporting young musicians." Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment, looking between us, the woman who had kept his secret for 25 years, and the niece he had both provided for and betrayed. Finally he nodded. Yes, it's time. The next few weeks were a blur of legal, negotiations, press releases, and emotional revelations. Angela worked tirelessly to structure the foundation, while Edmund began the delicate process of remastering Wesley's demos. Rosalind took a sabbatical from teaching to focus on writing comprehensive liner notes for each song, combining her academic expertise with her newly discovered personal connection to the material. The industry's reaction continued to evolve. Some condemned Thaddeus completely, calling for his exile from the music world. Others saw the tribute album as a form of redemption, a chance to right a long-standing wrong. Music journalists began digging deeper into Wesley's story, uncovering old recordings from his college days, interviews with former bandmates, building a picture of the genius that had been hidden for so long. Through it all, Rosalind and I grew closer, bonding over the shared process of discovering and reclaiming Wesley's legacy. She spent hours at the piano, learning her father's original arrangements, sometimes crying as she played, sometimes laughing at clever musical phrases she'd never noticed before. One evening, as we sat in the garden listening to a rough cut of the remastered demos, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for finally telling the truth, for giving me back my father." I held her close, remembering Wesley's words from so long ago. "Make sure these songs find their way to someone who'll do them justice." Finally, after 25 years, I had kept my promise. The truth had cost us all something: relationships, reputations, comfortable illusions. But as Wesley's pure, unaltered voice filled the garden he'd once loved, singing the songs he'd written for the daughter he'd never know, I knew we had gained something far more valuable. We had gained the truth, and with it, the chance to heal. The day everything changed again started like any other. I was in my studio, helping Edmund and Rosalind sort through more of Wesley's materials for the tribute album, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Something made me answer it, despite my recent policy of screening all calls. "Is this Marlowe? Blackburn?" The voice was elderly, feminine, and vaguely familiar. "This is Margaret Whitmore. I was Wesley's nurse during those final days." My heart stopped. In 25 years, I'd never heard from any of the hospital staff. "Yes, I remember you," I said carefully, catching Rosalind's attention with my tone. "There's something you need to know," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "Something I've carried for far too long. It's about that night, the night Wesley had his seizure. I saw something I should have reported then." I put the phone on speaker, gesturing for Edmund to start recording. "Go on," I managed, though my throat had gone dry. "I was doing my rounds when I saw Mr. Thaddeus in Wesley's room. He was at the bedside, but he wasn't just copying the songs." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "He was adding something to Wesley's IV. I thought maybe it was authorized, but later, when Wesley seized..." The phone slipped from my numb fingers. Rosalind caught it, her face pale. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Are you saying my uncle deliberately caused my father's seizure?" "I've gone over it 1,000 times in my mind," Margaret replied. "The timing, the way he jumped when he saw me, how he insisted everything was fine. I checked the medical records recently. They show an unexplained spike in Wesley's medication levels that night. Edmund was already on his phone, presumably calling Angela. My mind raced back to that night, seeing it in a horrifying new light. Thaddeus hadn't just stolen Wesley's songs. He'd ensured Wesley would never be able to expose the theft. "Why come forward now?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "I'm dying," Margaret said simply. "Cancer." When I saw the story break about the stolen songs, I knew I couldn't take this to my grave. I have documentation, copies of the medical records, my notes from that night. They're yours if you want them. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Angela arrived with a medical expert and a forensic accountant. Margaret's documentation was collected, analyzed, verified. The hospital records showed exactly what she claimed, an inexplicable spike in Wesley's medication that triggered the seizure that led to his coma. "This changes everything," Angela said, spreading the documents across my dining room table. "This isn't just copyright infringement anymore. This is potentially criminal." Rosalind hadn't spoken since the phone call. She sat at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys of her father's last composition, unable to play. I wanted to comfort her. But what could I say? How do you process the revelation that your uncle might not just be a thief, but something far worse? My phone buzzed again. Dahlia. "Turn on CNN," she said without preamble. "Thaddeus is doing a live interview. He knows." We gathered around the TV, watching in horror as Thaddeus, looking more composed than he had any right to be, addressed the allegations. "These accusations are absolutely false," he said smoothly. "I loved my brother. Yes, I made mistakes with his music, but to suggest I would harm him? This is nothing but a desperate attempt to extract more money from our families. Tragedy." "He's scared," Edmund observed. "Look at his left hand. He can't keep it still." The interview continued, with Thaddeus painting a picture of a conspiracy against him. Grieving family members manipulated by opportunistic lawyers. A dying nurse confused about events from decades ago. But there was something in his eyes, a haunted quality that hadn't been there before. "We need to move carefully," Angela advised. "These allegations are serious. We need more proof before we go public." But fate had other plans. Within hours, someone leaked Margaret's statement to the press. The story exploded across social media, with "Grand Justice for Wesley" trending worldwide. Music industry figures who had been reluctant to condemn Thaddeus over stolen songs now called for a full investigation. Marigold, predictably, took to social media to defend her husband, but her Instagram live session backfired spectacularly when she accidentally revealed that Thaddeus had been preparing for something like this for years and had taken precautions. Her hasty deletion of the video only made things worse. Then came the second bombshell. Edmund's forensic accountant discovered a series of payments from Thaddeus's accounts to a former hospital orderly, regular deposits starting the week after Wesley's death and continuing for 20 years. "Hush money," Angela said grimly. The orderly must have known something too. The police became involved, reopening the investigation into Wesley's death. Reporters camped outside my house, hoping for comments. Rosalind took refuge at Edmund's studio, unable to face the media circus. But the biggest shock came from an unexpected source. Imogen Blackburn, Thaddeus and Wesley's mother, who had maintained her silence throughout the original scandal, requested a meeting. We met at her nursing home, a luxurious facility paid for by Thaddeus's stolen success. She was frailer than I remembered, but her eyes were sharp as she gestured for Rosalind and me to sit. "I should have spoken up years ago," she began without preamble. "The night before Wesley went into the hospital, he told me something. He said Thaddeus had been acting strangely, asking detailed questions about his songs, about his plans for them. He was worried." Rosalind gripped my hand as her grandmother continued. "The day after it happened, I found this in Wesley's apartment." She pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a letter dated the day before Wesley's hospitalization. "Dear Mom," it read, "if anything happens to me, you need to know. Thaddeus tried to buy my songs today. When I refused, he became angry in a way I've never seen. He said these songs were wasted on a dying man, that he could make them immortal. I'm scared, not for myself, but for my baby. Please make sure my child knows the truth about their father. Love, Wesley." The letter slipped from my trembling fingers. All these years, Imogen had known, had suspected, had remained silent. "Why?" Rosalind asked, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because I had already lost one son," Imogen whispered. "I couldn't bear to lose another. But now—" She looked at Rosalind with tears in her eyes. "You deserve to know who your father really was, and who your uncle really is." As we left the nursing home, my phone lit up with urgent messages. Thaddeus had disappeared. His accounts had been emptied. His private plane had filed a flight plan to a country without extradition. "He's running," Edmund said when I called him. "The police are on their way to the airport, but—" We watched on live TV as Thaddeus's plane was stopped on the runway, as he was led away in handcuffs, his carefully maintained image crumbling under the harsh airport lights. Marigold was nowhere to be seen, having apparently decided that standing by her man had become too costly. The investigation that followed uncovered more than we could have imagined. The hospital orderly confessed to helping alter medical records. A former band member revealed conversations where Thaddeus had discussed taking care of the Wesley situation. Financial records showed elaborate plans to conceal evidence stretching back decades. The tribute album release was postponed indefinitely, as Wesley's death became the subject of a criminal investigation. The songs that had launched Thaddeus's career were now evidence in a possible homicide case. Rosalind threw herself into organizing Wesley's remaining works, as if by immersing herself in her father's creativity, she could somehow make sense of her uncle's darkness. She discovered previously unknown songs, theoretical music essays, even drawings, pieces of Wesley that had survived despite Thaddeus's attempts to erase him. One evening, as we sat in my garden listening to Wesley's demos, Rosalind turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Do you think Dad knew, that night in the hospital, when he made you promise about the songs? Do you think he knew what Uncle Theo was capable of?" I thought about Wesley's final moments of consciousness, the urgency with which he'd pressed the journal into my hands. "I think he knew something was wrong," I said carefully, "but he trusted us to make it right, eventually." The media circus continued to grow. Documentary filmmakers requested interviews. Publishers offered book deals. Hollywood producers talked about movie rights. But for us, it had stopped being about exposure or justice. It was about truth. The full truth, no matter how painful. As Thaddeus awaited trial, his carefully constructed world continued to unravel. Former collaborators came forward with stories of controlling behavior and veiled threats. Music critics re-examined his entire catalog, finding more songs that might have been appropriated from other sources. But in the midst of all this darkness, something beautiful emerged. Musicians from around the world began covering Wesley's original versions of the songs, stripped of Thaddeus's commercial alterations. Young artists cited him as an influence, studying his theoretical works that Rosalind had discovered. Wesley's voice, his true voice, was finally being heard, not through his brother's manufactured lens, but pure and unfiltered, exactly as he'd created it. The truth had cost more than any of us could have imagined. But as I watched Rosalind play her father's songs on the piano, her fingers finding the melodies he'd written while facing his own mortality, I knew that cost had been worth it. Wesley's legacy wasn't just his music anymore. It was the truth about his life, his death, and the brother who had tried to steal not just his songs, but his very existence. And in the end, that truth had set us all free. The morning of Thaddeus's trial dawned cold and gray. Camera crews lined the courthouse steps, their lenses following our every move as Rosalind and I made our way inside, Angela walking protectively beside us. The grand jury had indicted Thaddeus on multiple charges: involuntary manslaughter, fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Today he would face not just legal justice, but the weight of 25 years of deception. The courtroom was packed with faces from the music industry. Producers, critics, artists who had once celebrated Thaddeus's genius now gathered to witness his downfall. Edmund sat directly behind us, his presence a steady comfort. Marigold was notably absent, having filed for divorce the week after Thaddeus's arrest. When they brought him in, I barely recognized him. Gone was the carefully cultivated image of the tortured artist. In its place sat a man aged by guilt and fear, his silver hair unkempt, his designer clothes replaced by a plain suit that seemed to hang on his frame. The prosecutor's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. "This case," she began, "is about more than stolen songs. It's about a man who was willing to sacrifice everything: his brother's life, his niece's heritage, his family's trust, all for the sake of fame." The evidence mounted hour by hour. Margaret Whitmore's testimony, delivered via video due to her failing health, brought many in the courtroom to tears as she described what she'd witnessed that night. The hospital orderly's confession revealed the elaborate scheme to alter medical records. Financial experts traced the complex web of payments designed to keep people silent. But it was Wesley's letter to his mother that proved most damning. As it was read aloud, his fears, his premonitions, his love for his unborn child. I watched Thaddeus finally break. His shoulders slumped, his facade cracked, and for the first time, he looked directly at Rosalind with naked remorse in his eyes. During a break in proceedings, Edmund pulled me aside. "There's something else," he said quietly. "We found more recordings in the studio archives, sessions from the weeks before Wesley's hospitalization. He was working on something big, a concept album about mortality, legacy, and fatherhood. The songs Thaddeus took were just the beginning." My heart clenched. More of Wesley's work, hidden away all these years. More pieces of him for Rosalind to discover. "Does she know?" "Not yet. I wanted to wait until after." He gestured at the courtroom. "She needs to focus on this first." The trial continued for weeks. Each day brought new revelations, new layers of deception peeled away. Former band members testified about Thaddeus's obsession with his brother's talent. Music theorists demonstrated how Wesley's original compositions had been systematically simplified, commercialized under Thaddeus's name. Finally, Thaddeus himself took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "I loved my brother," he said, though the words rang hollow against the evidence. "His talent. It was pure in a way mine could never be. When he got sick, when we knew he was dying, I convinced myself I was protecting his legacy. But the truth is, I was jealous. I'd spent my whole life in his shadow, even though the world didn't know his name." He described that night in the hospital, the desperate plan to ensure Wesley couldn't expose the theft, the careful manipulation of his medication, the years of guilt masked by success and fame. "I never meant for him to die," he insisted. though the jury's expressions suggested they didn't believe him. The seizure was supposed to be minor, just enough to confuse him, to make his claims about the songs seem unreliable. But once it started, his voice broke. I couldn't stop it. Rosalind sat rigid beside me, as her uncle confessed to effectively killing her father. I wanted to shield her from this, but she deserved to hear the truth, all of it, no matter how painful. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The judge's sentence reflected the magnitude of the crimes. 25 years, one for each year he'd lived with his deception. As they led him away, Thaddeus turned one last time toward us. "Rosie," he called out, using the nickname she'd once loved. The songs, they were always better in his voice. I'm sorry I made you grow up thinking they were mine. Outside the courthouse, facing a wall of reporters, Rosalind spoke publicly for the first time since the trial began. My father wrote songs about truth, about legacy, about the power of authentic voice. She said, her voice steady. Today, finally, his voice has been heard. In the weeks that followed, we began the process of truly reclaiming Wesley's legacy. Edmund revealed the discovered recordings, and Rosalind immersed herself in this new treasure trove of her father's work. The concept album he'd been planning was hauntingly prophetic. Songs about a father preparing to leave his child, about the stories we tell and the truths we hide. The music industry's response was overwhelming. Labels fought for the rights to release Wesley's original works. Universities requested his papers for their archives. The Grammy committee posthumously awarded him a Lifetime Achievement Award, acknowledging not just his talent, but the tragic circumstances that had kept it hidden. One evening, as Rosalind and I sat in my garden listening to the newly discovered recordings, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Listen to this part," she said, cueing up a specific track. It was Wesley's voice, raw and pure, singing about a future he knew he wouldn't see. "When you hear these melodies, my child, know that every note carries my love. Though time and fate may keep us apart, my music will be the bridge between our hearts." "He knew?" she whispered. "He knew he wouldn't be there to raise me, so he left me these songs. And Uncle Theo, he stole not just the music, but my chance to know my father through it." The tribute album we'd planned before the trial took on new meaning. Instead of just correcting historical wrongs, it became a daughter's journey to know her father. Rosalind worked with Edmund to restore Wesley's original recordings, adding her own musical interpretations alongside them. A conversation across time between father and daughter. The project attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Musicians, who had once covered Thaddeus's versions, now wanted to record Wesley's originals. Music schools began including his theoretical works in their curriculum. A new generation discovered his genius, untainted by his brother's theft. As we prepared for the album's release, I found myself returning often to that last conversation with Wesley in the hospital. "Make sure these songs find their way to someone who'll do them justice," he'd said. At the time, I'd failed him, allowing Thaddeus to twist his legacy into something unrecognizable. But now, watching Rosalind bring her father's true voice back to the world, I realized that sometimes justice takes the long road home. Wesley's songs had finally found their way to exactly where they belonged, in the hands of the daughter he'd written them for. The album, titled Bridge Between Hearts, after that prophetic lyric, was released on the anniversary of Wesley's death. It debuted at number 1, with critics hailing it as a masterpiece of both musical archaeology and emotional storytelling. But more importantly, it gave Rosalind something she'd been denied for 25 years. a chance to truly know her father. Through his original recordings, his notes, his musical theories, she discovered not just the artist, but the man. His humor in margin notes, his philosophical musings between verses, his love woven through every melody. These were the pieces of him that Thaddeus could never steal. As for me, I finally felt free of the weight of silence. The truth had cost us all dearly. Reputations, relationships, comfortable illusions. But in the end, it had given us something far more valuable. Authenticity. Wesley's voice, pure and unaltered, singing across time to the daughter he'd never known. In my garden, where Wesley used to compose during those last summer evenings, Rosalind now sits at a piano we moved outside, playing her father's songs the way they were meant to be played. Sometimes, in the fading light, I close my eyes and can almost hear them duetting across the years, her fingers finding the melodies he left behind, his voice guiding her home. The truth had finally set us all free, and in that freedom we found something we'd thought lost forever. The pure, unaltered voice of love reaching across time, bridging hearts that fate had tried to keep apart. The day of the Bridge Between, Heart's album release concert at Carnegie Hall brought both triumph and unexpected turmoil. The venue was sold out, music industry elite filled the front rows, and a documentary crew captured every moment. Rosalind had spent months preparing to perform her father's original works on the same stage where, decades earlier, Thaddeus had performed the stolen versions to thunderous applause. But 3 hours before the show, everything threatened to unravel. A package arrived backstage, delivered by Marigold's lawyer. Inside was a USB drive and a note. "There's one more truth you need to hear. Edmund, Rosalind, and I huddled in the dressing room as we played the contents. A video recording from 1998, clearly filmed in secret. There was Wesley, alive and vibrant, sitting at a piano with Thaddeus. They were working on Midnight's Last Prayer, together, their voices blending in harmony, both contributing to the arrangement." "I don't understand," Rosalind whispered, her face pale. "This makes it look like they were collaborating. But we know Uncle Theo stole the songs." Angela, who had rushed over when we called, studied the footage carefully. "This changes nothing legally," she assured us. "The evidence of theft and everything else is still overwhelming, but it complicates the narrative," Edmund finished. "The pure victim versus pure villain story the media's been telling." Rosalind stood abruptly, pacing the dressing room. "All these years I've been trying to understand who my father was, who my uncle was. Now this?" She gestured at the screen where the brothers continued their musical collaboration. Were they friends? Partners? Was any of it real? I remembered those days before Wesley's illness became apparent. How the brothers would spend hours at the piano together. Thaddeus had always been drawn to Wesley's talent like a moth to flame, admiring, envying, trying to capture some of that pure creative force for himself. "Your father believed in collaboration," I said carefully. "He saw music as a conversation, not a competition. But Thaddeus, he needed to own it completely." A knock at the door interrupted us. The prison warden. "Mr. Blackburn is asking to make a statement before the concert. Livestream, as agreed in the plea deal." This had been part of the negotiation. Thaddeus would publicly confess, acknowledge Wesley's authorship, in exchange for certain considerations. But now, with this new video evidence, what would he say? The concert hall's massive screen flickered to life, and there was Thaddeus in his prison uniform, looking older than his years. The audience fell silent as he began to speak. "Tonight, my niece will perform her father's songs the way they were meant to be heard. he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You'll probably see that video from 1998 soon. Wesley and me, working together. And yes, there were moments like that. Moments when I could have chosen a different path. Could have been the brother and uncle I should have been." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "But those moments of genuine collaboration make what I did even worse. Wesley trusted me. He would have shared his gift freely if I'd only asked. Instead, I took everything. His songs, his legacy, ultimately his life. Because I couldn't bear being the lesser talent." Tears were streaming down Rosalind's face as her uncle continued. "The songs you'll hear tonight, they're not just Wesley's compositions. They're his heart, his soul, his message to a daughter he knew he'd never raise. I stole that message for 25 years. Nothing I can say will make that right." The screen went dark, leaving the audience in stunned silence. Rosalind gripped my hand, trembling. "I have to change the opening song," she whispered. "What? But we've rehearsed." "I know what I need to play." When the curtain rose, Rosalind sat alone at the piano, the spotlight casting her father's journal in golden light on the music stand. Instead of beginning with Midnight's Last Prayer, as planned, her fingers found a different melody. One from the newly discovered recordings, a song Wesley had never finished. As she played, her own composition began to weave through her father's framework. A conversation across time, daughter completing father's final work. The audience sat spellbound as the piece built to a crescendo that somehow contained both grief and celebration, loss and discovery, ending and beginning. The rest of the concert became something more than a tribute. Each song was reimagined through the lens of truth. Not just Wesley's original versions, but the complex reality of human relationships, of talent and envy, love and betrayal. Rosalind's playing acknowledged both the purity of her father's vision and the painful journey that had brought his music back into the light. During intermission, Edmund rushed backstage with news. The video of Wesley and Thaddeus collaborating had gone viral, but not with the effect Marigold had likely intended. Instead of undermining the narrative, it was being hailed as further evidence of the tragedy, showing what could have been if Thaddeus had chosen collaboration over theft, brotherhood over betrayal. The second half of the concert began with a surprise. The screen above the stage lit up with Wesley's face, footage from his college days that Edmund had discovered. Young, vibrant, he spoke about music theory, about the relationship between melody and emotion, about the songs he hoped to write someday. As the video played, Rosalind began to play along with her father's demonstrations, adding layers to his theoretical examples, showing how his ideas had evolved in her own work. The effect was magical. Father and daughter separated by decades, but united in musical conversation. For the finale, she invited other musicians who had been influenced by Wesley's recently discovered works to join her on stage. Together they performed Midnight's Last Prayer, as it had never been heard before, starting with Wesley's original demo recording, building through Rosalind's interpretation, and ending with a full orchestral arrangement that honored both the song's intimate origins and its universal themes. As the last notes faded, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 15 minutes. Critics in attendance would later write that it wasn't just a concert. It was a reckoning, a reconciliation, a restoration of something long lost. Backstage afterward, surrounded by flowers and well-wishes, Rosalind found a moment of quiet to open her father's journal to its final pages. There, in Wesley's handwriting, was an unfinished thought. Music isn't just sound. It's truth set, free in the air, finding its way home to hearts that need it most. She looked up at me, her eyes shining. That's what tonight was, wasn't it? The truth finally finding its way home. The aftermath of the concert brought more changes than we could have anticipated. Music schools created scholarships in Wesley's name. His theoretical works became required reading in composition classes. The documentary about his life and legacy won awards, bringing his story to an even wider audience. But more importantly, it brought a kind of peace, the complex truth of brotherhood both honored and betrayed, of talent both shared and stolen, of legacy both hidden and restored, somehow felt more healing than the simpler narrative we'd first discovered. Thaddeus, serving his sentence, began working with music therapists in the prison, finally using his performance skills to help others rather than to maintain his own fame. He would never be forgiven exactly, but understanding the full scope of his relationship with Wesley helped us comprehend, if not excuse, the choices he'd made. Rosalind established the Wesley Blackburn Foundation, dedicated to preserving and promoting authentic voices in music. The Foundation's first project was to create a digital archive of all her father's work, not just the songs, but his theories, his teaching materials, his unfinished pieces. 1 year after the Carnegie Hall concert, we gathered in my garden, now registered as a historical site where Wesley had composed his final works. Rosalind sat at the outdoor piano, her father's journal open before her, playing a new piece she'd composed based on his theoretical frameworks. As the music filled the air, I thought about truth, how it's rarely as simple as we want it to be, how it can hurt and heal in equal measure, how it demands to be heard even after decades of silence. Wesley's voice had finally found its way home, carried on melodies that bridged time and tragedy, performed by the daughter who had inherited not just his talent, but his understanding of music's deepest purpose, to speak truth, to heal hearts, to build bridges across the chasms that life creates. The truth had cost us dearly, but it had given us something priceless in return. A legacy restored, a voice reclaimed, a bridge between hearts that even death couldn't sever. 5 years after the Carnegie Hall concert, I stood in my garden, now transformed into the Wesley Blackburn Memorial Music Center. The old Victorian house where I'd kept his secrets for 25 years had become a sanctuary for young musicians, its rooms filled with the sound of students discovering their authentic voices. Rosalind, now the center's artistic director, had just finished teaching a masterclass on her father's musical theory. Through the window, I watched her at the piano, surrounded by eager students as she explained the intricate relationship between emotion and melody that Wesley had explored in his work. The Wesley Blackburn Foundation had grown beyond our wildest expectations. What started as a simple tribute had evolved into a movement celebrating artistic's authenticity. The foundation sponsored young composers, funded music education programs, and maintained the ever-growing archive of Wesley's work. Today was special, the 5th anniversary of Bridge Between Hearts and the opening of a new wing dedicated to musical preservation. But it was also the day we'd chosen to share one final truth, one last piece of Wesley's legacy that we'd discovered in the most unexpected place. 3 months ago, while preparing for the anniversary, Edmund had received a letter from the prison chaplain. Thaddeus, suffering from terminal cancer, had made a deathbed confession. There was one more recording, he revealed, made the day before Wesley went into the hospital. He'd hidden it away, too ashamed to even destroy it. The recording had been found exactly where Thaddeus described, in a safety deposit box under an assumed name. When we first played it, the impact was overwhelming. It was Wesley, hours before his hospitalization, performing a complete concert of original material. But more than that, it was Wesley telling stories between songs, sharing his hopes for his unborn child, his philosophy about music, his love for his brother. Theo has always been the performer, Wesley's voice said on the recording. But he's more than that. When we collaborate, when he lets himself be genuine, there's real magic. I hope someday he'll understand that his own voice is enough. The irony of those words, spoken hours before Thaddeus would begin his tragic descent into betrayal, was heartbreaking. But they also offered a new perspective on the complex relationship between the brothers, on the tragedy that had unfolded. Today, as part of the anniversary celebration, we would play this recording for the first time in public. The garden was filled with people. Musicians, critics, students, and supporters of the foundation. Rosalind stood at the podium, her father's journal in her hands. 5 years ago, we began a journey to reclaim my father's voice, she began. We thought we were simply correcting a historical wrong, exposing a theft, seeking justice. But what we discovered was something more complex, a story about the relationship between authenticity and artistry, between love and fear, between truth and silence. She spoke about the newly discovered recording, about Wesley's words of hope for his brother, about the tragedy of choices made from fear rather than love. My father believed that every voice has value, she continued. Even as he faced death, he saw the potential for beauty in collaboration, in shared creativity. As the recording began to play, I watched the audience's reaction. Wesley's voice, clear and strong, filled the garden where he'd once composed. Between songs, his laughter, his insights, his humanity reached across time to touch everyone present. But it was his words about Thaddeus that hit hardest. The love, the understanding, the hope he'd held for his brother's artistic growth. In the audience, I saw tears on faces that had once condemned Thaddeus without understanding the full complexity of the brothers' relationship. During the reception that followed, Edmund pulled me aside. There's something else, he said quietly. Something in the archives we hadn't noticed before. He handed me a folder containing sheet music, compositions Wesley and Thaddeus had written together in college, before ambition and fear had poisoned. Their collaboration. They were brilliant together, Edmund said softly. When they truly collaborated, they created something neither could have achieved alone. This discovery led to another project, a retrospective album featuring these earlier collaborations, released under both brothers' names. It became a teaching tool at the center, demonstrating both the power of genuine artistic partnership and the tragedy of its loss. Thaddeus passed away in prison 2 weeks after making his final confession. In accordance with his wishes, his ashes were scattered in the garden where he and Wesley had once made music together. Rosalind, showing a capacity for grace that amazed me, had agreed to this, understanding that the truth of their story included both harmony and discord. The Wesley Blackburn Memorial Music Center continued to grow, its mission expanding beyond preservation to include reconciliation through artistic expression. Students learned not just Wesley's music theory, but the deeper lessons of his story, about the courage to be authentic, the importance of genuine collaboration, the healing power of truth. Rosalind's own compositions evolved, incorporating elements of both her father's innovative techniques and the early collaborative works of the brothers. Her pieces told the story of loss and discovery, of truth hidden and revealed, of bridges built across time and tragedy. One evening, as the sun set on another day of teaching and creation at the center, I found Rosalind at the piano in the garden, playing one of the recently discovered collaborations between Wesley and Thaddeus. The melody was complex, weaving together two distinct voices that somehow made each other stronger. "I understand them both better now," she said, not stopping her playing. Dad's pure creative force, Uncle Theo's performative brilliance. Together, they could have been extraordinary. She was right. The tragedy wasn't just Wesley's death or Thaddeus's betrayal. It was the loss of what they could have created together if fear hadn't overwhelmed love, if ambition hadn't silenced authenticity. The center became a place where young musicians learned to balance these forces in their own work. They studied Wesley's theories about authentic expression alongside Thaddeus's understanding of performance and presentation. They learned that true artistry requires both depth and accessibility, both individual voice and collaborative spirit. As I walked through the center's halls, now lined with photos documenting the brothers' journey, from their early collaboration to their tragic separation, I reflected on how truth, like music, isn't always simple. It has movements and themes, harmonies and dissonance, moments of clarity and periods of complexity. The Wesley Blackburn Foundation's mission had evolved from simple preservation to something more profound, teaching future generations that authentic, artistic expression requires not just talent, but courage, not just technique, but truth. In the garden where Wesley composed his final songs, where Thaddeus had once performed them as his own, where Rosalind now taught her father's theories while acknowledging her uncle's influence, music continued to build bridges between past and present, between loss and discovery, between silence and truth. The story of the Blackburn brothers became more than a cautionary tale about artistic theft. It became a complex exploration of human nature, of the relationship between talent and fear, between love and ambition. It taught us that truth, like music, can heal even as it reveals our deepest wounds. And in the end, that was Wesley's greatest legacy. Not just his songs or his theories, but his understanding that music, at its purest, is truth set free in the air, finding its way home to hearts that need it most. As the sun set on another day at the center, Rosalind's playing filled the garden with the harmonies her father and uncle had created together so long ago. In those notes, I heard not just the tragedy of what was lost, but the beauty of what remained, the truth that had finally found its voice, the legacy that had found its way home. The story of Wesley and Thaddeus Blackburn, of stolen songs and silenced truths, of betrayal and redemption, would continue to teach and inspire. But now it was also a story of reconciliation, of understanding, of the complex harmony that can emerge from discord when truth is finally given its voice. In the garden where it all began, music continued to build bridges between hearts, carrying Wesley's message forward, that every voice has value, that truth demands to be heard, and that sometimes the most beautiful melodies are born from the courage to be authentically ourselves. 10 years later. The 10th anniversary celebration of the Wesley Blackburn Memorial Music Center drew musicians and music lovers from around the world. The garden where Wesley had composed his final works was now an internationally recognized sanctuary for authentic artistic expression, its paths lined with plaques bearing his quotes about music, truth, and the courage to be oneself. I stood at the back of the packed amphitheater, watching Rosalind prepare for her performance. At 40, she had become not just a guardian of her father's legacy, but a renowned composer and teacher in her own right. Her latest symphony, Echoes of Truth, had earned her the Pulitzer Prize for Music, combining Wesley's theoretical frameworks with her own innovative style. The center itself had grown beyond our wildest dreams. What started as a simple memorial had evolved into a global institution, with satellite programs in music schools across 5 continents. The Wesley Blackburn Foundation Scholarship Program had launched countless careers, its emphasis on authentic artistic expression, creating a new generation of musicians unafraid to find and share their true voices. Today's event was more than just an anniversary celebration. It was the premiere of a groundbreaking project that had taken years to complete. Using advanced AI technology and the extensive archive of Wesley's work, we had created an interactive installation that allowed students to engage in virtual collaborations with both Wesley and Thaddeus, using their early cooperative works as teaching tools. The project, controversial when first proposed, had become a powerful demonstration of the complex relationship between the brothers. Students could study not just Wesley's original compositions and Thaddeus's commercial adaptations, but the genuine collaborative pieces they'd created before ambition and fear had torn them apart. Edmund, now in his 80s but still sharp as ever, joined me at the back of the amphitheater. "Remember when we thought this would just be about correcting a historical wrong?" he mused, watching the crowd gather. "Now look at what it's become." He was right. The story of Wesley and Thaddeus Blackburn had transcended simple narratives of victim and villain. It had become a teaching tool about artistic integrity, about the relationship between commercial success and creative authenticity, about the price of silence and the power of truth. Marigold, of all people, had become an unexpected ally in recent years. After Thaddeus's death, she'd undergone her own journey of reconciliation, eventually joining the Foundation's board and using her industry connections to support young artists struggling to maintain their authentic voices in a commercial world. "Thaddeus taught me about the cost of losing yourself to ambition," she'd said in a recent interview. "His tragedy wasn't just what he did to Wesley. It was what he did to himself, denying his own genuine talent in pursuit of his brothers." The lights dimmed, and Rosalind took the stage. Behind her, a screen showed rare footage of Wesley and Thaddeus in their college days, performing together at a campus coffee house. Their voices blended perfectly, Wesley's innovative compositions enhanced by Thaddeus's natural showmanship. 10 years ago," Rosalind began, "we gathered here to reclaim my father's voice. What we've discovered since then is that every voice matters. Not just the pure, original compositions, but the interpretations, the collaborations, even the mistakes that lead us to deeper truths." She turned to the piano, her fingers finding the keys. The piece she played was one we'd recently discovered, an unfinished collaboration between the brothers found in Wesley's college notebooks. Rosalind had completed it, weaving together her father's innovative harmonies, her uncle's performative flair, and her own unique perspective. As she played, the interactive installation came to life. Virtual images of Wesley and Thaddeus appeared on stage, their young faces full of joy as they performed together. The technology was remarkable, but what moved the audience to tears was the genuine connection between the brothers, captured in those moments before everything went wrong. The performance became a conversation across time. Rosalind playing with the virtual versions of her father and uncle, 3 generations of musicians finding harmony in a piece that spoke of both what was lost and what remained. In the audience, I spotted familiar faces. Margaret Whitmore's daughter, who had followed in her mother's footsteps and now ran a music therapy program at the center. The former hospital orderly who had finally told the truth, now volunteering with prison music programs. Imogen Blackburn's caregiver, who had helped preserve crucial evidence of Wesley's final days. After the performance, as guests explored the new interactive installation, I found myself in Wesley's old study, now preserved as part of the historical exhibit. His journal lay open in a glass case, turned to the page where he'd written those prophetic words about truth, finding its way home to hearts that need it most. Rosalind joined me, her father's old guitar in her hands. "I had a dream about them last night," she said softly. "Dad and Uncle Theo, playing together like in those old videos. In the dream, they found a way to make it work, to balance artistry and ambition, authenticity and success. Maybe that's what we're doing now," I suggested, finding that balance they couldn't achieve. The center had indeed become a place where commercial success and artistic integrity weren't seen as opposing forces. Students learned both Wesley's pure creative approach and the practical aspects of building a sustainable career. They studied Thaddeus's marketing genius alongside warnings about the cost of losing one's authentic voice. The Wesley Blackburn Foundation had expanded its mission to include support for artists facing pressure to compromise their creativity. The True Voice program, inspired by Wesley's story, provided both financial assistance and mentoring to help musicians navigate the complex relationship between artistic vision and commercial viability. As evening fell, guests gathered in the EO garden for the final event, a concert featuring students from around the world, each performing pieces that reflected their own journey toward authentic artistic expression. Some played Wesley's compositions, others performed their own works inspired by his theories. All of them understood the deeper lesson of his story, that truth, like music, demands courage to be heard. The garden itself had become a living testament to resilience and renewal. The bench where Wesley had composed his final songs now bore a plaque with both brothers' names, acknowledging the complexity of their relationship and the tragedy of its dissolution. But around it, new music flourished as students gathered to compose, to collaborate, to find their own voices. Marigold, who had helped fund the interactive installation, stood near the back, tears in her eyes as she watched the young musicians perform. "Theo would have loved this," she said quietly. "Not the fame or the recognition, but this. Young artists finding their truth through music. That's what he and Wesley had in the beginning, before everything went wrong." The Foundation's work had expanded beyond music to include all forms of artistic expression. The Brothers Legacy program specifically focused on helping artistic collaborators maintain healthy creative partnerships, using the Blackburn brothers' story as both inspiration and warning. As the evening drew to a close, Rosalind took the stage one final time. The piece she played was new, a composition that incorporated elements from both her father and uncle's styles, while remaining uniquely her own. It spoke of loss and discovery, of truth hidden and revealed, of the complex harmony that can emerge from discord when authentic voices are finally heard. The Wesley Blackburn Memorial Music Center had become more than a monument to a stolen legacy recovered. It was a living, growing testament to the power of artistic truth, a place where new voices could find their strength, and established artists could rediscover their authentic core. In the decade since we'd first revealed the truth about Wesley's songs, the music industry had changed. The center's emphasis on authentic expression had influenced how labels worked with artists, how success was measured, how creativity was nurtured. Wesley's theories about the relationship between emotional truth and musical composition had become fundamental texts in music education. But perhaps the most profound change was in how we understood the story itself. What had begun as a clear tale of theft and betrayal had evolved into a deeper exploration of human nature, of the relationship between talent and fear, between love and ambition, between the pure creative force that Wesley embodied and the commercial instincts that had both elevated and destroyed Thaddeus. As the final notes of Rosalind's composition faded into the night air, I thought about truth, how it refuses to stay buried, how it demands to be heard, how it can both wound and heal. Wesley's voice, silenced for so long, had finally found its way home, carried on melodies that bridged time and tragedy, performed by the daughter who had inherited not just his talent, but his understanding of music's deepest purpose. The garden, where Wesley had composed his final works, where Thaddeus had stolen a legacy, where Rosalind had discovered her own voice, continued to nurture new generations of musicians. In this sacred space, truth and music remained intertwined, each strengthening the other, building bridges between hearts that time and tragedy had tried to separate. And somewhere, I like to think, Wesley was listening, hearing his truth finally, set free in the air, finding its way home to all the hearts that needed it most. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.